The role of Hadith in Ikhtilāf among Muslim jurists. The jurists are in disagreement on certain issues because they reached varying conclusions with regard to the abrogation or otherwise of a hadith on which they based their arguments. We may enumerate some of the relevant juristic rules as follows. Number 1. The prayer of the follower behind a seated imam. Conflicting hadith have been reported in this regard. For instance, there is a hadith by Aisha that the Prophet, while ill, prayed sitting down while the people behind him were standing. He pointed to them to be seated and said, "An imam, prayer leader, is supposed to be followed. When he bows down, you must do the same. When he prays seated, you must also pray the same." This hadith has been mentioned in Sahihain, and it contradicts another hadith also narrated by Aisha that the Prophet, while sick, prayed sitting down while Abu Bakr, reciting Allahu Akbar, prayed standing up, and the people followed him, Abu Bakr. This hadith is also reported in the Sahihain. There is a contradiction between these two hadith. Imam Shafi'i mentions that the latter hadith has an abrogating effect on the former. He argues that this was said by the Prophet in his death sickness. This fact, according to him, has also been corroborated by some other reports. Abu Hanifa and Thawri hold the same position. It is reported that Imam Malik, when he called for the takhsis and not the naskh of this first hadith, he said the aforementioned permission to lead the prayer seated is the privilege of the Prophet. It is inconceivable that someone else may lead the prayer in the Prophet's presence. Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Ishaq, Awza'i, Ahl al-Zahir, and some jurists of Ahl al-Hadith, such as Bukhari, disagreed with the above view. They neither believe in the abrogation of the first hadith nor permit a follower to pray standing behind a seated imam. Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal tries to reconcile between these two conflicting hadith. According to him, the first hadith would be acted upon when the imam started his prayer seated, so the follower would do the same. However, the second hadith will be implemented when the imam started his praying standing up, but due to some illness sat down. In such a situation, the followers can offer their prayers standing up. Ibn Qudama points out that whenever reconciliation of two conflicting hadith is possible, neither of them must be abrogated. 2. Annulment of ablution due to touching one's own male genitalia. Contradictory hadith have been reported in this regard too. It is reported that a companion, Talq, asked the Prophet if performing ablution was obligatory after touching the male organ. The Prophet replied in the negative. The above hadith is contradicted by another hadith reported by Busra bin Safwan. She heard the Prophet saying, "If any one of you touches his penis, he should perform the ablution." The jurists have disagreed on the application of these two hadith. Umar, his son Abdullah, Abu Huraira, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqas, Shafi'i, Hanbal, and according to the mashhur narration, Malik as well acted upon the last mentioned hadith, whereas Ali ibn Mas'ud, Ammar, Abu Hanifa, Thawri uphold the former hadith. Those who adopted hadith of Busra claimed that hadith of Talq had been abrogated, and Nawawi said that the Naskh had been supported by Khattabi and Al-Bayhaqi. The fourth time penalty for drinking liquor and the controversy over it. Some ahadith were reported prescribing capital punishment for the person who is convicted for the fourth time of drinking liquor. On the other hand, some other hadith have been reported to the effect that the Prophet did not execute anyone for such a crime, but only flogged him. The first category of hadith was narrated by a number of companions. One of them was Muawiyah, who reported the Messenger of Allah saying, "If they drink liquor, flog them. If they drink, flog them also. If they drink for the fourth time, execute them." The majority of the jurists were of the opinion that the hadith prescribing capital punishment were abrogated by others, which says that the Prophet did not apply that. Among the latter is the hadith of Jabir, which mentioned that the Prophet had flogged a person, and did not execute him. Some jurists also claimed that abrogation was a general consensus. As Shafi'i said, capital punishment was abrogated, and there is no disagreement amongst the scholars on this. Tirmidhi mentioned the same thing. No disagreement is known among the scholars, neither now nor before, but it seemed that the claim of consensus is not without contradiction, for other scholars did approve the capital punishment. Among them was Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Amr. Of the companions, and Ibn Hazm and As-Suyuti, and also a contemporary scholar, Ahmed Shakir. The latter devoted a lengthy research on this question in commentary on the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, which he later published in a separate book. His conclusion was as follows. 1. The hadith prescribing capital punishment are valid and not abrogated. 2. The claim of consensus on the question of abrogation is not correct, since the above-mentioned scholars have differed with the others. 3. The ahadith which conflict with those ahadith that prescribe capital punishment contain some sahih as well as da'if ones, contrary to what Ibn Hazm has asserted that they are all da'if. 4. The ahadith contradicting the ones that are prescribed capital punishment, though they are authentic, do not invalidate them for two reasons. A. The authentic among them did not explicitly tell that the one whom the Prophet flogged and did not execute had drunk liquor for the fourth time. Those which explicitly mentioned it are not authentic. That which is both authentic and conspicuous on the point is the hadith of Al-Nu'aym alone, and that man took part in the Battle of Badr. That was probably the reason why the Prophet did not execute him, in which case the rule here would be an exceptional, not a general one. But Schacht did not mention any evidence to support his conclusion, and this was an exception and not the rule. For the rule is the practice of the Prophet is a general law, unless an evidence indicates otherwise. We do not know in the history of the Islamic jurisprudence that any of the pious caliphs, or those who came after them, had executed any person for such a crime. It was not known. Also, from the practice of the Prophet, and this is from the practice of the Prophet, and this strengthens the opinion of the majority. We see that Ibn al-Qayyim has followed a different direction. He said that the capital punishment was not abrogated, but it was not obligatory either. He considered capital punishment here as ta'zir, a punishment at the discretion of the judge. If, for example, it became very common that people drank, and the way that they could be deterred was by applying capital punishment, then the ta'zir by the judge could take place. He also claimed that some of the ulama have advocated capital punishment, but did not quote any of them. These are just some of the examples which explain the impact of Naskh on juristic disagreements. However, the books relating to the subject of Naskh of Hadith that have been mentioned contain many more examples. Special mention may be made of the book of I'tibar by Al-Hazimi.